Shalom, and welcome to the economic panel of the Abraham Accords towards a new Middle East conference. The Abraham Accords themselves envision that both Israel and the UAE will reaffirm their shared belief that the establishment of peace and full normalization between them have a transformative effect on the Middle East. By spurring economic growth, encouraging technological innovation, and forging closer people connections, we can have an impact not only on the UAE, Israel, and Bahrain, but on the wider Middle East as well, including potentially on Judea and Samaria. In fact, given that Israel and the UAE are leaders in fields such as renewable energy, water tech, smart cities, this impact of this new partnership, of this new friendship, can go beyond the region and impact the entire world for good and our planet as well. Now, since the signing of the Abraham Accords, we've seen a tremendous outpouring both of goodwill and of business interest on both sides. In the organization which I helped found, the UAE Israel Business Council, we've seen thousands of business people on both sides expressing interest in developing relationships, in looking for opportunities, and getting to know one another. I'm joined today by an amazing panel of experts, both on the economic and financial opportunities and potential of the Abraham Accords and on the wider geostrategic and geopolitical implications. I'm joined today by Ahmed Zakaria, Vice Chairman of the Zakaria Family Group, a diversified family business with activities in many arenas. I'm joined by David Wumser, a Senior Fellow at the Center for Security Policy in Washington, D.C., and at the Cahlet Policy Forum, the founder and CEO of the Delphi Global Analysis Group, and a former advisor on the Middle East to U.S. Vice President Dick Cheney and Undersecretary of State John Bolton. I'm joined by Riyad Zayadat, a business leader in Jordan, focusing primarily on the fields of tourism, who formerly served as the head of the Research and Study Department of the Jordanian Senate. And lastly, I'm joined by John Medved, CEO of Our Crowd, a leading equity crowdsourcing platform in Israel, and probably the first Israeli investor to appear on a public stage in the UAE when he appeared to speak about his unique model and the potential for cooperation already in December 2019 in Abu Dhabi. So I'm very excited, and let's get right to it. Ahmed, let's start with you. As an expert in the economic and financial sectors in the UAE, how do you think those sectors and the business community in large can help build bridges between Israel and the UAE? And what do you think are the areas of highest potential for cooperation between the two countries?
So first of all, thank you very much for having me here, Asher, on this program. I would like to first state that we're driven by economic imperatives, cultural and social imperatives as well. We have a young population that have huge aspiration and are hungry for life, are hungry for change, and hungry for moving forward. We're connected in a global economy with global players, and by no doubt, Israel is a global player in the main arena. And I believe that there are several areas of cooperation that both the UAE and Israel can work together in terms of technology being one of the most important. You've got logistics, you've got aviation, you've got green energy, you've got agri-tech, which is something very important to us here in this part of the world. Knowledge-based businesses, intelligence, tourism, technology, the list goes on and on. And I think that with the delivery of these powerful ideas and leadership that we have here in the UAE, we have tremendous infrastructure. And I think what we're looking for now is that soft infrastructure that I think Israel does have and that we can also adapt here in the UAE as well, such as knowledge, R&D, and innovation.
Thank you, Ahmed. And Riyad, if we are looking at the tremendous potential which Ahmed described just now, how do you think these flourishing relations between, or the relations that appear that they will soon be flourishing between Israel and the UAE, how do you think they can affect the Israeli-Jordanian relationship as well?
If I get Mr. Ahmed, I think we already have relations, business relations between us. We have, and I think the next stage for business, it's not going to be only country. It's universal. It has to be more than one country. Everybody has to deal with each other. We have tight relations. We have similar geography between Israel and Jordan. That helps. And I think what helps us a lot, that we need to involve the middle class in each country.
And who do you think will be the leaders in terms of which sectors in Jordanian society do you think could lead the potential strengthening of these relations between Israel and Jordan?
First of all, the people. Then after the decision making.
Thank you. Now,
did I get you right?
Yes. I agree. The people need to be the leaders. In this case, in the case of Jordan, I agree that unfortunately, as we've seen, the peace between the leadership has been a cold peace to date. And I also agree that the way to strengthen that peace is by building the people-to-people relationships, and in this case, working from the ground up. David, yes. I wanted to ask you, as an expert on the geostrategic implications, how do you think that this new economic relationship between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain, how will that affect the region and beyond the region, especially given the strategic location of both Israel and the UAE?
Well, I think, we don't really have time to do a long history lesson, but one thing I would like to note is that throughout history, geostrategic realities often are the precondition for economic and trade patterns. So what we have is, over the long term, trade patterns are almost dictated by geostrategic realities. I think what we're seeing now with the UAE-Israel peace agreement, and Bahrain as well, is that there are deeper geostrategic factors at work here that will eventually create very strong economic realities. This is not to say that there aren't a great amount of immediate opportunities and synergies between the UAE economy and the Israeli economy. And these things should be immediately exploited. But in the long term, what we see is a large block of nations geostrategically coming together. Japan, India, UAE, Israel, Greece. These are driven by geostrategic factors right now, and there's inescapably Iran, but less mentioned, but I think equally important, the danger of Turkey, drive these countries together. And the fact that the United States, which has defined the international architecture of trade and security for the last 60, 70, 80 years, is to some extent withdrawing. It's withdrawing in part to take care of its own problems, and it will still be an immense power, and it will still dictate the global realities. But at the end of the day, what you're seeing is America's allies beginning to emerge as a more independent and robust force in and of themselves, working together. So what I see is ultimately the UAE-Israel relationship having a strong economic dimension, but grounded in the larger geostrategic condition, and that will drive them ultimately to include India into this and Japan into this. So if you look at the synergies of those four economies, I think you see a tremendous amount of opportunity. But I would definitely look at those four as a block and as an economic opportunity taken together.
Thank you, David. Thank you for that analysis and that overview. Ahmed, returning to the Israeli-Emirati relationship, what do you think are potential pitfalls, and what are things that Israeli business people and perhaps Emirati business people as well should have in mind and take care to avoid or to adapt given the unique business culture of both countries?
I mean, well, first of all, let me just say one thing. You know, we're on the cusp of the fourth industrial revolution, and I think both countries can come together, creating jobs, acquiring future skills, and so much more talent from it. In terms of pitfalls, only one thing I could say is we're fast-paced here. Our leaders have given us amazing tools. They're phenomenal leaders who have given us amazing tools and drive us to always be the best. So we are fast-paced. We are fast-paced. We as a people are fast-paced as well. We're always thinking outside the box, and we always want to move forward and build the best to the best of our ability, and create synergies and opportunities for everybody. That's what we really want to do.
Now, and if Ahmed, if I could ask also a follow-up question following David's insights, how do you think, or do you think, that the economic and business sector can contribute to advancing peace and normalization with additional Gulf states as well?
Well, the opportunity is extremely fruitful. Business is a bridge for peace. Business is a bridge to other nations. And I believe through the example that we are leading here in the Gulf region, in terms of what we've done, the bold steps that we have taken, others will look at us and say, you know what, let's move forward. Let's not reminisce about the past and move forward and open these doors and look at these strategic initiatives and these strategic goals that we have to take that can actually benefit people and both people of Israel and the Gulf countries altogether. So the potential is huge. And we're blessed here to have incredible leadership that really have given us this air of tolerance, air of acceptance, and to move forward. We are very driven, very fast-paced, and very driven.
With us is John Medved, CEO of Our Crowd, a leading equity crowdsourcing platform, and really one of the leaders in terms of developing relationships between the UAE and Israel. As I mentioned, John was probably the first Israeli investor to appear on a public stage in the UAE, and Our Crowd has already signed an MOU with Al Nabuda's group, Phoenix Capital, to invest $100 million in the tech ecosystems of both countries. So, John, how do you see the future of the bi-directional, bilateral relationship between the UAE and Israel business and tech sectors, and what kind of impact is this going to have on both the Israeli tech ecosystem and the Emirati tech ecosystem?
I want to second what Ahmed said about the speed in which the UAE is moving. We are moving at warp speed in terms of making this new agreement take shape in the economic realm. The genuine enthusiasm on the part of Emirati entrepreneurs, investors, is all being supported by their amazing government institutions that are set up to make this kind of investment and cooperation work. Whether it's in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Bahrain, there will be others, inshallah, joining us. What has been most striking to us has been simply the almost innocent goodwill. I've been on so many Zooms now where people are giggling and smiling ear to ear. Not because this is silly, because of the unbridled joy of doing great business, which is going to be good for your country and for the partner's country, but also for the region and the world. The sense that we're making history, that it's so long overdue and so about time. And the fact that our two countries are coming together in this way is going to have a huge impact on our countries, on the region, on the world, and in particular in the economic sphere. And what I think people have to keep in mind is that the Emiratis in particular are very entrepreneurial. They have a really interesting startup ecosystem. We're already looking at investing in Emirati startups. Remember, they're a country who has already, sent an astronaut to the space station. They've launched their Mars probe. Okay, they are, people who we can cooperate with in the startup nation at eye-to-eye level. This is not about one side investing and the other side developing. This is about a bilateral investment opportunity for Israelis to put money in the Gulf, and for investors in the Gulf to put money in Israel, but more importantly, to work strongly together on joint ventures where we're able to cooperate with people who are expert in logistics, in smart cities, in transportation, in desert agriculture, in ed tech, healthcare, and the range of opportunities is huge. So I'm quite bullish on this, and often start my day pinching myself and asking, is this really real? And you betcha, it's amazingly real.
Thank you, John. Thank you. And I want to follow up with that, with this question that I asked Ahmed as well. What do you see as potential pitfalls or potential areas where specifically Israeli investors or business people need to be careful as they're developing their relationships with their Emirati partners?
Building things that our children and grandchildren and their children will be the beneficiaries of. And you have to, I think, feel a huge weight of history and responsibility when you go into these relationships to make sure that you're behaving with the utmost ethics, with the utmost sensitivity, to realize that this is breaking new ground, that we're creating this culture of cooperation. So far, so good. But I worry that some people might take a short-sighted sort of make a quick buck kind of attitude, and that's not what's called for here.
Since we are close to each other, so the tourists who come from all over the world, we should have more like it's more wider programs for those tourists. We can market your country, and you can market our country, and we already have the Petra as a something in common. Many people from your side, they come to Petra. Mm-hmm. We can increase this to be to more than one country. And we have here in Jordan, we have like the religion tourism, since we have the baptism in Jordan. And we need to work on many things. Like we already have many tourism areas, and we need to market this more and more.
Thank you.
And we already, since we are close to each other, the tourists can move easily between us and Israel.
Thank you. And I'm sure we're all very much hoping to see that happen very soon. David, if we look even closer to Israel, what do you think are the implications of this new economic relationship for the reality and the experience in Judea and Samaria and in the Palestinian Authority as well? Do you think that these new connections between Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain will also have an impact right here in the Holy Land?
Look back over the last decades, again, the geostrategic matters here. I think the UAE-Israel relationship provides a bridge to the Palestinians, even though geographically that doesn't quite make sense, but it provides a bridge to the Palestinians. I think if you look back over 40, 50 years, the Palestinian economy and the Israeli economy were deeply related until the first Intifada, and with the violence and the decisions that were made to launch some of the violence by the Palestinian leadership, especially in the second Intifada, you saw the great separation of the Israeli and Palestinian worlds. And I think this also put a block on Israeli-Jordanian interactions as well, which caused a major economic problem. I think the re-entry of the UAE and the ability to leverage the relationship with the UAE to help encourage the rise of a different Palestinian leadership, a new generation of Palestinian leadership that is interested in ultimately the welfare of the Palestinian community. I think provides an excellent opportunity to push out, to provide a barrier to countries like Turkey and Iran, which were using the stasis, the situation in the Palestinian area to create a complete shutdown of economic activity that's productive in the long run. Israel is becoming one of the, Ahmed said that there's a fourth industrial age. He's absolutely right. And in that industrial age, the UAE and Israel are becoming very important global economic centers. And I think this is the opportunity for the Palestinians, and to some extent the Jordanians with them, to position themselves differently, but it would require a generational change in the leadership among the Palestinians. And I think that is where really the role of the UAE, in addition to the money and the investment and the speed and intelligence of investment, comes in. But it also helps politically and geostrategically.
John, also over to you, looking at we've also had business relations and investments in a number of the countries in the region. How do you see this new relationship, this new open relationship between Israel and the UAE having an impact on the region? And you can take that in any direction that you'd like.
So I think that the normalization with UAE and Bahrain is obviously only the start of a renewed process. I don't know if there'll be 4 countries more, or 6 countries, or 8, or even 10, God willing, that will join, but there will be more countries joining. And we're finding already enormously important changes in our contacts with some of the other obvious players in the region, where they're the early movers, let's say, are already moving. Obviously we're all waiting for the formal normalization process to take its appropriate steps. But business people are reading the tea leaves and feeling the way the wind's moving, and are starting to preempt. And that's a very big thing. Remember that we're talking about a huge market opportunity, right? In other words, the GCC itself is a remarkable market for activity. But when you take the larger Arab and Islamic world that now can be addressed through partnerships with the Gulf countries, this is extraordinary. Because remember, there are almost 2 billion people of Islam in the world. And the fact that we are now able to work together, and not just to sell stuff, but to fix things, to make the world better, to solve problems of water and health and energy and climate change and desertification. We have so much to offer each other. It is really one of these things where I believe it or not, I feel that the importance of this agreements has been underhyped. I don't think people understand how fundamentally this has changed the rules of the game for the betterment of all of our people, but really for the entire world.
While the economic potential, I think, is clear, both for Israeli and Emirati relations, but for relations between Israel and many other countries, as John said, the challenge has been in some countries, not in the Emirates, where we've seen, like as John and Ahmed mentioned, a tremendous outpouring of goodwill spearheaded by the Emirati leadership. But in other countries, one of the main challenges has been public opinion. And Ryan, I wanted to ask you, how do you think that we can shift public opinion in Jordan so that it's supportive and open to all of the economic possibilities that exist in enhanced relations between Israel and Jordan?
I agree with Ahmed that business is a bridge for peace between the people. The business will help us already to shift those opinions to the right track. They need to feel the business, feel the benefit of it. That helps a lot. That's the way we can shift those opinions. and we need to like more social relations between both people to see the right side, the good side for each other. And the business will help a lot.
Thank you. David, what role do you think the American administration can play in encouraging specifically the business and economic ties between Israel and the UAE, though I don't know how much encouragement they need as they are advancing at warp speed, and between Israel and the broader region?
Well, yes, I think that you mentioned the fact that they're moving at warp speed. So I really don't know if the United States can give much more of a push to the UAE-Israel part of it. But one thing I've noticed dealing with Japanese companies, Indian companies, and so forth, is that Israel is really a world they don't understand. And Israel, like the UAE, operates at a speed of decision and investment that the Japanese and to some extent the Indians are not as much used to. As well as on the other side, the Greeks and so forth. So I think one role the United States can play is to bring some of these more distant elements of this emerging coalition, strategically, but I think also economically, to essentially put the kosher stamp, so to speak, on the UAE-Israel relationship and investment in the joint structures that will emerge from that, and the economy. Israel has immense access to Silicon Valley. Now it has immense access to the UAE. The UAE is a fast, smart, incisive investor. The Far East can miss out if they don't join. And I think the primary role of the United States right now is to turn to the Far East, specifically Japan, Korea, and India, and basically say, listen, this is a very important economic bloc emerging, and it would be very important for your investors in your country to feel the encouragement from the United States, the sanctioning from the United States to do business in that framework. I think that would help.
Can I make a comment here? It's so interesting. Just this morning, I was on a call with a group of Japanese businessmen about a webinar sponsored by JETRO, which is the state trade investment board in Japan. And you know what they're interested in talking to Israel about? The importance of the new UAE-Bahrain agreements and its implications for Israel-Japanese trade. Remember, Israel's trade with Asia for the last decade has been booming. The Abe period in Japan has grown our trade by hundreds of percent. And Japanese companies are very active now, in particular in the Israeli market, opening up partnerships and whatnot. And they're totally aware of what's going on now in the rapprochement with Israel and its neighbors in the Gulf. And this is going to have a huge impact broader. And I think David is spot on in terms of his analysis here.
And Jim, let me follow up with that. And this is also probably a question which many of the people viewing this panel from the economic and financial sectors are asking themselves and are interested in. So Ahmed mentioned a number of fields. He mentioned agri-tech, he mentioned intelligence, he mentioned green tech, which you also talked about sustainability and the shared challenges of desertification and climate change. What other areas do you believe have potentially very, very high promise, whether it's fintech perhaps, or health, or any other areas that you think, whether in Israel or the UAE, are going to be particularly productive, especially in the initial stages of developing this relationship?
Remember that the UAE in particular and Bahrain are financial powerhouses. And therefore, the area of fintech, financial technology is, in my mind, first and foremost in terms of things that can be accomplished together. And there's great interest on the part of the UAE authorities of bringing technology into this area in their country. And in fact, they've already got a track record of recruiting overseas coders and programmers and system architects to come and build things in their region. And I predict that you will see Israeli tech companies who have pretty much hit the ceiling in terms of employment. One of the real challenges here in Israel is even while we have 900,000 unemployed, our tech economy is missing 20,000 bodies. Okay, we need more skilled people. Now, long term, we have to do this by bringing in more Palestinians and Arab Israelis into the tech sector, and Haredim, ultra-Orthodox, more women. But we also need to think about how we turn this region into a magnet for smart entrepreneurs and technologists from around the world. And if they want to work on the beaches of Tel Aviv or on the beaches of Dubai and Abu Dhabi, it's all good. And I think that together, our ability to recruit, to bring people and to work on these things, in fintech in particular, is important. I also think that anything having to do with artificial intelligence, which of course is not really an area because it's infusing all areas, right? There's AI, which is driving ag tech, and AI, which is driving mobility, and AI, which is driving healthcare. And as you know, Israel is probably one of the top 3 countries in the world developing artificial intelligence technologies together with the US and China. And our friends in the Gulf are very aware of this. And I think you'll see a lot of AI infused deals, in particular in healthcare. We're already in discussions on that, but also in other disciplines that will utilize Israel's, sort of core competence in the AI arena, but direct it to others.
David, as somebody who's also been consulting to companies and to countries on the region, are there areas that you see as of particular importance or particularly high potential?
Yes, I would second everything that John said. This is not an instead of it. I would add to it that one should really look at the big industries, the huge scaled industries that you see operating in Japan and Korea, and where they're beginning to have problems is on the innovation side. They're not producing the innovation that they needed to produce. And I think the role of the UAE and Israel is to be the incubator for ideas in the framework of large industries, capital industries. It's a whole new role for Israel, rather than just the high-tech world living within a high-tech industry. I think I would encourage the UAE and Israel to think also about the role that innovation is going to have to play in these large structures of industrial production in Japan and Korea, and how they can integrate into those structures as the innovation incubator, innovation stimulator of these increasingly ossified and slower moving industries.
Well, I think it's clear that the Abraham Accords both have tremendous potential in terms of the UAE-Israel bilateral relationship, but as we've heard from our panelists, have really a transformative potential for both the Middle East and much further, looking out to Europe, looking out to Asia, to Japan, to Korea, and even beyond. And obviously, I think the impact of this Abraham Accords will only be clear to us in a few years, but I think it's clear that the Middle East will look different in a few years because of this, and that the people-to-people connections and the business and economic and financial sectors have an extremely important role to play in building this new Middle East. So I want to thank all of our panelists, to Ahmed, to John, to David, and to Riyadh. Thank you so much for your insights, and thank you very much to all of the viewers. Thank you.